Hey, everybody, good morning.
Hey, look at that.
We're on.
We're on. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. My name's Audrey Lodato. I am the Director of Regional Programs for Best Friends.
And I am Scott Giacoppo. I'm the Director of National Shelter Support. I'm going to be the one running around the room today, and she's going to be standing up there. Those lights are annoying.
They are annoying. So this is Hidden History's Visible Impacts, how historical policies influence killing in shelters. So animal welfare has sort of an interesting and sometimes dark beginning. So today we're going to take you through a little animal welfare history. We're going to talk about some of the things we still do in animal welfare today that became policies because of something that made a lot of sense at the time the policy was established. And we're going to talk about some of those things and whether they still make sense now. And what they could look like if we reimagine some of those things.
Can I interject one quick thing? I just want to clarify, we're going to be talking about a lot of policies that don't make sense and that sound like bad people were doing these things.
Yes.
I want to be clear, we are not talking negatively about the people who actually performed these services and these policies. They did so with their best intentions, to save animals, to help animals. They just didn't know any different. I just want to make that clear, because when you hear some of the stuff we're going to talk about, like, oh my gosh, who could ever do that?
Yes.
I've done some of this, and it's all done out of a place of kindness, but we just didn't know any different.
People do the best they can with the information that they have at the time, right? And it's important to recognize that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're going to start in colonial America. And it's important, I do want to call out that dogs and cats were in this country long before the colonists came, but a lot of our ordinances and things started with the colonists. So that's why we're starting there, but full acknowledgement that dogs and cats were here ahead of time. So colonial America, this is an agricultural society, right? People had very big families, 10 kids or more were super common, they're family oriented, they live far apart from each other, right? It's rural living. So what we would consider a city now, what they considered a city was like very much just a small town, a very little town center. And because of that, the pets were far apart from each other too. So we didn't have animals on top of each other. And so dogs had a role in this community, right? And their role was to work. So dogs were used for hunting, they were used for guarding livestock, and sometimes, unfortunately, things like dog fighting. And dogs were kept as pets in some of the same ways that they do now, but people kept a lot of different animals as pets, right? Which is one thing that's really interesting. I think nowadays we think about pets, we think about dogs and cats, but back then it was common to have a dog outside, a cat outside, maybe you had a domesticated raccoon, maybe you had a squirrel, and all of these things could be pets. And I brought this, if anybody wants to check it out. This is not colonial, it's Victorian, but it's a little silhouette cut of a girl and her pet squirrel. It's pretty cool. So I brought that, I'll have it up here if anybody wants to check that out later. So one interesting thing to think about in society at this time is the concept of comfort dogs or lap dogs. And put a pin in that. So society, much as it was in colonial America, they did have some dogs valued above others, right? And we're going to talk about that more a little bit later. So the colonists, they didn't look down on dogs at all. They actually really cared for their pets a lot. They cared for them deeply. And actually the first anti-cruelty ordinance came from Massachusetts. And it said, where Scott is from, we have a round of applause for Scott being from Massachusetts. He's very proud of this, yes. And it actually said that if you were purposefully cruel to animals, you would get sentenced to time in the stocks or the pillories. So that's pretty cool, right? As they should have, right?
We should still do that. That's...
Cheers for the stocks, right? Now, during this time, people were living by a pretty thin margin, right? Like you were just kind of fighting for your family to survive. And so if a dog killed your livestock, that was a very serious thing, right? Because they're killing your food or your livelihood. And so it's here that we start to see the origins of like ordinances that go around for nuisance behavior. So like, here's one that's up on the screen. Any dog that kills a sheep is to be killed by hanging unless the owner pays double the value of the sheep, right? Pretty interesting. But it's along with these things from like spooking horses, biting people, that we start to see like the very first ordinances being developed. And that also comes down to like marking your animals as owned, right? So stray animals would be brought to an impound lot, right? And all the way back then, if you were a stray cow, if you were a sheep, if you were whatever you were that was stray, you would go to this impound lot. And if you had a collar, right, that marked you as owned, and then you could go home. So the origin of that really was here, and the origin of the word pound. Other ordinances around this time, there's a funny one, another funny one from Massachusetts that said if your dog was a nuisance, he had to be tied up, but only in the daytime. He could run away at night, that was okay. Or you could
Boston's
be sent
got a
away
pretty
killed.
big nightlife, so.
Yeah, nightlife, right? So during this time, cats, right, pretty much under the radar, not too much going on with cats, except that they had an association with the devil, which I think is interesting. And how that came about was that there was a pope, his name was Pope Innocent VIII, and he did not like that cats were nocturnal. He just didn't like that. It didn't jive with his sensibilities, right? And so he said that the cats were the devil's plaything, and that started a long process of cats being connected to the church and as a demons, and they were othered in that moment. And who remembers the Salem witchcraft trials and the other witchcraft trials, right? That perpetuated that belief. That was also in this time, right? So during this time, we really start to see an association with cats and the devil. But otherwise, cats are just kind of doing their thing. There's not a lot of cat laws that came about through this time. Add anything?
No, we're going to talk more about cats and the devil later on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Who's interested in hearing more about cats and the devil? Yeah, okay.
Right?
An interesting topic, right? Okay, moving on to the Industrial Revolution. So this is actually my favorite period of time in history, so I can get a little nerdy about this. So the Industrial Revolution and Victorian America, like 1740 to like the 1860s into the 1910s. So for those of you who are not familiar, there's a lot of cool stuff happening during this time period. It's a time of rapid expansion and development. People are moving away from that agricultural society and into cities, right? And so all of the things that come along with that start to surface. The reason they were doing that is because there's all these inventions that are happening. So we're going toward a manufacturing society, so steam engine, spinning jenny. I promised Peter Wolf I would talk about the cotton gin, the telegraph. All of those things are happening in this time. So people are moving to the cities for opportunities, for manufacturing. And they're moving their agricultural lifestyle to the cities. So they're taking their horses, and they're taking their cows, and they're taking their barn, and they're taking their dogs and cats, right? All of these things meant that people were living on top of each other. So these municipalities, at that time, they're trying to solve a multitude of problems. We've got like housing issues, sanitation issues, all of these things. And of course, we have now lots of free roaming dogs and cats living amongst them. And so what happened? We started to get a lot of nuisance complaints, right? That makes sense. You want to talk about dog catchers?
Yes. Isn't there a slide for that not coming up next?
Yes, we can do
Yeah.
that.
So this is where the cities, you know, there was a problem with rabies. Rabies came about, hydrophobia, and the cities felt they needed to do something about it. And there was no animal control at the time. So what they would do is they would pay someone 5 cents a dog that they captured to bring in and kill, right? So, and 5 cents was a lot back then. And if you think about who would do this, it's not the most upstanding members of the society, right? And what ended up happening was a lot of owned dogs were stolen from people and not given back, right? And this is really where we came up with the term dog catcher, right? I've spent years in the animal control world, and I hate that word, dog catcher. It is a derogatory term in my world, and it depicts people like this that don't care. They just go out, round up dogs, kill them for 5 cents a dog. And you wanted to talk about the goat stone, which, all right, so in case you haven't already noticed, you're gonna find Audrey is the researcher and the nerd of the group, right? So I didn't really do much research into as deeply as she did, and I just learned about a goat stone. So could you tell?
Yeah, I'll tell you about
goat
this.
stone?
Who's read Harry Potter? Put your hand up. Who knows what a bezoar is?
Microphone.
So a bezoar is a stone from the stomach of a cud-chewing animal, right? And this is interesting. There was a belief in this time period that if you did contract rabies or hydrophobia, you could use this mad stone and you could put it on you and it would jaw the rabies out. And they even had beautiful fancy cases for the bezoars. Yeah, they would, just like that. That's an example. I tried to get an actual bezoar, but they're very hard to acquire. I just want to let you know. I wanted to bring one so that you guys all could see it. But the reason I point out the Bezoar, right, is because we need to think about what information we had at the time when we were developing these ordinances and the things that made sense, right? So at the same time that we were believing that all of the stray dogs had to come in because they probably carried rabies, we also thought that the stone from a stomach of a goat would cure it, right? So just thinking about the foundational origin of some of these policies.
And this is also why you'll notice a lot of animal control departments fall under the local health department, right? Every city and town has a different model these days, it seems like, but a lot of them fall under the local health department, and it's because of this origin, because it started with trying to control rabies, which is still a basic fundamental component of your local animal control, is to help prevent the spread of rabies. Mm-hmm. This is where it started.
Yeah. And one of the things that came about during this time period, going back to those society dogs, is that people believe that those well-bred dogs would never carry rabies. And when you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because the well-bred dogs were living mostly inside, mostly with people, and so they weren't out amongst being outside dogs catching rabies, like the stray dogs or the, now you start to see words like cur or mongrel or yellow dog. And those are being applied to the stray dogs in the street. And none of those things were complimentary, right? Those are not great terms. Fear of rabies was also super exaggerated by the media. So here's a nerdy fact. The paper tax was repealed right around this time. And when the paper tax was repealed, print media exploded, right? And so people are just printing everything because that was entertainment in these days. You went and you got whatever magazine that there was. And so there were a lot of stories printed exaggerating rabies and how severe rabies was. And that really contributed to public pressure on municipalities for these bounties that Scott was talking about.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I actually found one article that I thought was really interesting talking about in New York City, remember, a small city at the time, where they brought in 9,000 dogs at 50 cents a dog to be killed because of a print article offering a bounty. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And the way they used to, for those of you who don't know, and I think it's a lot of people in this industry do know, but the way they used to kill these animals would and you could see the picture in here, they had a big cage. They shoved all the dogs in a cage and they lowered them into the river and drowned them. Right, that was their euthanasia. And it was actually a public spectacle. People would come down to the river and watch it happen. So I love when I tell people that, right? I do a lot of training for animal control officers, right? And when I tell them that, they're all like, oh my God, that's horrible. How could they do that? Let's think for a moment. In 15, 20 years from today, because there will be a best friends conference, because we're going to, in 15, 20 years from now, right? We're going to have a new group of people. What are they going to be horrified about that we're doing today? I really want everyone to think about that. I believe that we're going to talk about euthanasia at all. And people in the audience are going to be like, oh my God, you actually took an animal's life because you couldn't find a home? That's horrible. But it's institutionalized now, and that's what we're here to talk about today. But just for a moment, think about what could you be doing, what policies, what could you be doing today that people are going to look at 10, 15 years from now and be like, what? That's insane. Because it's happening. It is happening.
So we'll talk a little bit about the ASPCA. I think it's very relevant. So it was during the later half of the Industrial Revolution that the ASPCA was founded. So everybody knows the name Henry Bergh, I'm sure, in this room. He was born in 1813 in New York, and then he went to Russia and he was working as an American diplomat. And while he was there, he saw somebody beating a carriage horse. And this horrified him. He thought it was just the most horrific thing, and he decided in that moment that he was going to dedicate his life to helping animals. And so he came back to New York, and he founded the American SPCA, the ASPCA, as we know it today. And what's interesting about that is, so he founded the American SPCA, which is as we know it today. And what's interesting about that is it had been in Europe for a long time, like since 1826, right? And this is the official seal of the SPCA, which is something I always share when I do a historical presentation, because it's pretty intense, right? It's like an angel of mercy over the carriage horse, pretty scary. And that was drawn in 1867 by a gentleman named Frank Leslie. Is there anybody in this room who has SPCA in their name who's been around for a long time? Is your shelter over 100 years. Okay, we've got quite a few. In this time period, if you wanted to form an SPCA, what you would do is you would write to the New York SPCA and you would request that to start a chapter. And so if you've been around for a long time, that's likely how your organization got founded. Somebody a long time ago wrote a letter to the New York chapter of the ASPCA, and Henry Bergh himself probably wrote your organization back and approved you to begin a foundation, which I think is really cool.
I like to think that in Massachusetts, we said, New York, now. And we started the MSPCA 2 years later to, get it right.
But this is fiction. It hasn't been verified.
Anyway, the other thing a lot of people don't know is how many of you are associated with a Humane Society? Right? Humane Societies, one of the differences is Humane Societies was started to help children as well. In fact, the Washington Humane Society, which is now, I ran animal control for Washington, D.C. when it was Washington Humane Society, now known as Humane Rescue Alliance. They have laws in their books still protecting children. So an officer of the Humane Rescue Alliance kind of has more authority to protect children than animals. And that's why there's a difference between the SPCA, which specifically spells out cruelty to animals, versus a Humane Society, which is designed for both animals and children.
Interesting, right?
See, I know some history that I didn't live.
So during this time period that we begin to see the distinction between animal shelters and the municipal shelters, right? So in general, we've got these two things happening parallel. We've got the municipal movement, which is protecting pets from people, right, and municipal agencies, going along with Henry Bergh and the ASPCA and this movement to, protect animals and, provide them with rights. And so here we start to see, this is where it gets really interesting, this divergence. So we see the foundations of our first animal shelters here, and this was very controversial. A lot of these shelters, the first two shelters, were actually founded by women in Pennsylvania, and that's Morris Animal Refuge and Pennsylvania SPCA. They both say they were first. They will argue to the death about which one really was. They have a lot of interesting facts on both of their web pages, worth checking out. But the animal shelters would take animals from these impounds or from the public, and their goal was to provide for them humane care, and then this is also where we start to see the concept of a humane death, right? So we start to see the word euthanasia being used here, and we start to see death removed from the public eye.
Yep.
So to Scott's point, right, previously it's public entertainment. These animals are being killed by drowning, by clubbing, people are watching it, and the people behind the animal protection movement were horrified by this, and they said no, and we're gonna, worry about how do we provide them a humane death. Food, water, shelter, some adoptions, some reclaims, the foundation of all of that. So it's just interesting to think about that, because when we now are horrified or scared or nervous to talk to our communities about whether or not we're euthanizing animals, this is why. This is the foundation of that. This is why this is a secret sometimes.
Yeah, they took it behind closed doors. Right? They didn't want the public to see it. They took it behind closed doors and stopped talking about it. And that's why, like to Audrey's point, even today, we still struggle with people being transparent, agencies being transparent and sharing their data.
Mm-hmm. If you'd like to share your data, Best Friends has SPDA, generates lots of good reports.
I'm sure everyone in here does or will by the time they leave.
All right, so in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so the animal welfare movement's continuing to evolve, and this is a really interesting time in history too, right? We begin to see this term pet overpopulation crisis. And this is being used to describe both the overpopulation of pets in shelters, and then also the movement to save pets. So it's kind of, both ways. So in this time, spay-neuter surgery is available, but spays are considered like a massive abdominal surgery. They're not very accessible to shelters in general, so castration is a lot easier, neuters, right? This one always lands. This is very interesting. Shelters and rescue organizations are killing all of the female animals because those animals can reproduce, right? So here's a whole field of workers who are running these organizations. They don't have a lot of options to save the animals. They're doing the best they can. They can't spay neuter. So in order to prevent more animals from coming in, they're killing the female animals. They would adopt out the males, and then restrictive adoption processes started for the female animals, because if you wanted to adopt a female animal, they really wanted to make sure that you weren't going to breed them. So these restrictive adoption processes that we have sometimes, they didn't start about animals going home. They started to prevent animals from coming in, right? Which isn't a problem that we have any longer.
Right, and this is also the time when we as an industry started saying, if you can no longer take care of your pet, we'll take them. That the shelter is the safe place to bring them. And that's where this whole thing, we're trying to undo that now in a lot of ways, but this is where we took it upon ourselves to say, we are the saviors, we are the ones that will help this animal, we have the best option, please, if you can't take care of your animal, just give them to us and we'll deal with it. And that's where it all started, and that's what got us into this mess that we're in now. We are in a mess. I hope everyone agrees on that, right? We got a little bit of a mess going on out there.
Right. So this bit about the restrictive adoption processes, it became an industry standard that we actually couched on a lot in the 1970s, right? So this, it's very often quoted that we don't adopt out the female animals. And as late as 1975, the San Francisco SPCA, which a decade later becomes the first no-kill community in the country, was still killing all of the female animals for this reason. So that's pretty interesting. Another thing that happened during this time period is we start to see like wage differentiation. Who in animal welfare feels like they're underpaid? Anybody gonna be honest about that? No? Okay. We see wage differentiation here away from animal service officers being paid less than firemen, police, other public service agencies. And there was a woman named Phyllis who presented at an HSUS conference just about this very topic in the 1970s. And she said that in general, animal welfare workers rank under garbage men in terms of priority for municipalities. So I thought that was an interesting quote.
Yep, it's true. And that's still true today. We deal with municipalities across the country that don't want to give any money to the local shelters, and they're municipal shelters.
Mm-hmm. Nope. So the 1980s, probably, arguably, maybe the most important decade in the animal welfare movement, because it's the beginning of the no-kill movement, right? It's the reason we're all here today, right? So in 1984 in Kanab, Utah, a group of individuals got together and said, we don't like the status quo. We want things to be different, right? And they took the animal control contract in Kanab, Utah, and then they took Utah, and made the goal to be that no-kill. And here we are today, working all toward this goal together. And so Best Friends was founded in 1984, which I think is pretty wonderful.
Excuse me. Shh. Sorry. I can't mute, I'm sorry.
In the 80s, we also saw Rich Avanzino break his municipal contract with the city of San Francisco. And he said, so he was the executive director of the San Francisco SPCA, and he said, I am not going to take in every single animal and adhere to this contract, which isn't good for the animals in this organization. What we're going to do is prioritize life-saving and save all the animals. And this is where we saw our first no-kill community in the 80s. We also saw the Animal Welfare Act, which protects laboratory testing animals, so that was passed in the 80s. And then there's a very important article called In the Name of Mercy. It's written by a gentleman named Ed Duvin. You can find that online if you just Google it, it's easy to find. And it is an article that calls animal welfare agencies to the carpet for their lack of transparency. It is a fantastic article. He talks about how we don't have a national regulatory agency. He talks about how we're not transparent with volunteers. He talks about how we're raising money off the backs of these animals and killing them. And he just really holds our entire industry accountable. And so all of these things kind of happening together put a level of accountability on animal shelters that we really haven't seen before to prioritize live outcomes. So that started in the 80s.
I started in the 80s too. You'll hear more about that.
I was born in the 80s. All right, so from all of these things, what remains in place?
Most of these are still happening in a lot of different places, and during my presentation yesterday, we talked a lot about reading the laws and the difference between may and shall, right? All animals running at large shall be picked up, right? Versus may be picked up, which is optional. But a lot of places, all stray animals shall be picked up and impounded to the local shelter. Right, and that includes the dog that accidentally slipped out of the yard, the dog that jumped the fence. I'll never forget. I was head of animal control for Washington D.C. for a month. right? I just moved into Virginia, and I had a backyard, and I'm like, I'm gonna foster a dog. And I got a dog, and I brought him home, and I let him out in the backyard, and that dog made a beeline for that fence, and like a deer, pop, up and over that fence. Here I am, the head of the chief animal control officer, and I just lost a dog, right? And you know how embarrassing it was to call animal control and tell them that I can't find my dog? But it happens, right? It happens to all of us. And there's policies in place today in communities, probably in your communities right here, that require animal control to impound that animal, bring that to the shelter, issue you a citation, and reclaim that dog.
And what's wild about that, Scott, is that a lot of those ordinances, if you go back and look when they were written, 1920,
Yeah.
1910, 1935.
Yep.
So go look where those mandatory ordinances came into play for your community. It's super interesting.
Yep, absolutely. Trapping and removing cats, all right? So I'm a big advocate of TNR programs, right? CCP, community cat programs, whatever you want to call them, TNVR, right? I was adamantly opposed to them, okay? I was a field officer. Horrible things are going to happen to those animals out in the streets, right? And when I went to DC, I found out that there was a law written in 1929 requiring animal control to round up and kill all the stray cats. I got there in 2007, and we were still doing it, and we were doing almost like 2,000 a year. It doesn't work. It never has, it never will. Why do we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results? Right? So, but a lot of places, I mean, how many of you in this room here still have a community where trap and remove is being utilized? Thankfully, only a small handful, but it dates so far back, and it doesn't work. It never has, never will. Sorry.
And speaking of cats, you know, I realized I forgot this bit. So during those industrial times, why did cats start coming into animal controls in the first place? Why did officers start to pick up cats? All right, so it's the Industrial Revolution. We'll go back there for a minute. They are sanitation, right? We discovered germs, right? That's really fantastic. Germs, we know now why people get sick. So we are going to remove our horses, our livestock, our pigs, all of that out from our cities, and we're going to implement sanitation. We're going to have sewers. And do you know what came as a result of all of this? We removed cats' food sources. Who knows what happens when you remove the food source from a colony of cats? All of a sudden, they're like, hey, we're cats, we're hungry, like, do you have any food, right? They're showing up at your door. And it wasn't that the cats weren't there. It's that we took away their food so they became more visible, and then that was what started the nuisance behavior, and that is what led to animal control beginning to pick up cats, like around 1900. Before that, they weren't picking up cats. You know why? The cats were taking care of themselves. They weren't so visible. So that's an interesting thing, too. If colonies are managed, we don't need to pick up the cats, and we know this as far back as, 1860. Yeah.
But through this all, we somewhere down the line allowed ourselves and forgave ourselves for taking these animals' lives. Because they were in the shelter, we ran out of room, there was no other options. We didn't see any other options. So we allowed and we normalized taking their lives, right? And I was part of that. We're gonna talk more about that. I mean, I couldn't tell you how much time I've spent in the euthanasia room, and it was okay because there was no other option, right? Think about that. It doesn't make sense. But we have allowed ourselves throughout history, because of this, to give ourselves permission to do that. I always ask, is it easier to get an animal into my shelter than out? Right? And some of these things make no sense to me. Drop boxes, owner surrender in the field. Yes, we all want to be open admission, right? But we take it too far. One of my favorite, most recent examples of this is, let's say I walk into your shelter and I see I'm a cat guy, so I'm gonna use cats as an example. I see a really cute cat, and he's tucked with his face buried into the corner. How many of you have seen cats like that, right? All right, so now let's take it a step further. He's got a little cast on his arm. He maybe came in stray with a busted up leg, shelter, put a cast on, and he's sitting in the back of the cage with his head buried. And I say, oh my gosh, I want to take that cat home. And what do I got to go through? Hopefully you're doing open conversational style adoptions, right? So we have a chat. Yeah, I'm a cat guy. I'm going to take him home. Blah, blah, blah. Great. I fill out a little survey, I drop, some money down, you get them taken up, you box them up, and I walk out. You never see or hear from me again, right? Now, I walk into that shelter and I see that same cat, talk to that same person, and I say, wow, I can't adopt right now, but you know what? I can take him to my house. I have a spare room. I can give him a chance to settle in, heal up, maybe bring him out of his shell. I'll take care of him for a few weeks, right? I can foster that foster thing you guys are always talking about. What do I have to do to foster? Oh my gosh, well, you gotta fill out an application, you gotta do a background check, you gotta go through training, you gotta learn how to do dog handling because you wanna foster a cat, you gotta go through medical training, you gotta meet with our foster coordinator, you gotta do this, you gotta do that, you gotta do. It's harder to foster than it is to adopt. Think about that. In most places, it is harder to foster than it is to adopt. And we talk all this big talk about open conversational style adoptions, right? Get these animals out and all that, but we still make it difficult to foster. Anyway, look at it. I mean, because we have opportunities through conversations, we have opportunities to make it harder to get an animal into the shelter than out, but we are failing in that in a lot of places. My favorite.
Scott's been waiting for this.
Oh my God, my absolute favorite. So, I started working in animal shelters in 1988, okay? And I was working at the MSPCA in Boston, and my first year in the shelter, coming up towards late October, I was told that we were shutting down cat adoptions between October 28th and November 1st. And I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'm like, oh my gosh, why? Why would we do that? Because the Satanists will come in. Connie, you were there with me, girl, right? The Satanists are going to come in and adopt these cats to sacrifice on Halloween. And we weren't too far from Salem, Massachusetts, so those witches were all over the place.
True story. Raise your hand if you worked in animal welfare when this was a policy. I'm just curious. Yeah, I did it too.
Right?
Oh my gosh. Why did we do this?
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Again, this was a national thing. It wasn't just in Massachusetts, right? We wholeheartedly believed this, right? And as I said earlier, I like to consider myself a kind, compassionate person that is working in this field still 30-some-odd years later because I love animals and I want to protect them, right? So it was never any ill intent. I could not tell you how many cats I walked down to that euthanasia room myself and performed that procedure because of that dumb.
Pope Innocent VIII in 1484 didn't like that they were outside at night.
Right.
Just didn't agree with him.
But as an industry, we legitimately believed that. Think about that. That the Satanists and the witches were going to come in and adopt a cat to sacrifice. Couldn't tell you how many cats died as a result of that policy and the way we did it.
And some other things that we've, rethought. Pets as gifts, right? Remember when that was a big thing? Raise your hand if you wouldn't do pets as gifts, right? Yeah, everybody in this room, we've rethought that now, right? Because we thought if you gave somebody a pet and they weren't ready for it, they wouldn't love it, which we all know is untrue.
No.
Home-to-home rehoming.
What do you mean you put your pet for adoption on Facebook or Craigslist? Oh my God. What kind of person would do that?
At some point during your career, you heard Craigslist and wanted to hide under the bed, right? If it at one point incited rage in you to hear that somebody put a pet on Craigslist, right? Home-to-home rehoming. Now we have websites that do that.
Now we get mad at you if you don't do that before you try and surrender your pet, right?
Pediatric spay neuter. There was a time when this was very, very controversial to spay a 2-pound kitten. That was a big deal. So point being, there's a lot of things that we have already rethought. And that leads us to believe, right, that there are other things that we should be rethinking that we're doing now.
Absolutely.
The most dangerous phrase in our language, we've always done it this way. Hopefully you got a button.
Everyone get their buttons?
Everybody got a button?
Yeah, we made sure, yeah. Want to make sure everyone gets their buttons. And when we say this, we've always done it this way. Could you advance to the next slide? This is one of my favorites. If you do what you've always done, you're only going to get what you've always gotten. I'm a Tony Robbins fan. If any other Tony Robbins fans in the, just a couple? All right, I'm a big Tony Robbins fan. But anyway, I love that.
So the good news is, right, that the things that caused us to put a lot of these policies into place in the first place are no longer issues. We don't need these antiquated beliefs anymore. We've got spay neuter, we've got vaccines, we have all of the knowledge in the world in this little box in our hands, right? We've got all the education we could want. We can collaborate with each other, we have conferences. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to save animal lives. It's all there for you, you just need to implement it. And I thought we'd talk about COVID, because COVID is one time where we did save a lot of lives because we were forced to change our beliefs, right? So COVID happened, we were all very scared and very nervous in this big event. So what happened? We were forced to be extremely transparent with our community about what it is that we needed, because we weren't sure that we would be able to come into work every day to take care of the animals, right? We had to get those animals out. We did not have a choice. So all of a sudden, every shelter in the country was very transparent with their community about what was gonna happen and that we needed the community to show up for us and take animals in. And what happened? We had a massive drop in intake.
Yeah, and one of the things, I had the honor of serving as the president of the National Animal Control Association when COVID hit. And agencies all over the country were calling us saying, how do we operate? How do we work? And we set out these guidelines. For those of you, I don't know if any of you utilized them, but we sent these guidelines to municipalities talking about only responding to emergency calls, right? Only doing home-to-home adoptions and all of the stuff that we talk about on a daily basis. We said, this is what you should be doing. And agencies did it. And guess what? The world did not come crashing down around them because of it. But unfortunately, only a small number of agencies continued post-COVID, if there is a post-COVID, I don't know. Anyway, it's not the new norm for a lot of agencies. They went back to doing what they've always done. But a lot of agencies did say, you know what? I don't have to respond to every single dog running down the street. Right? I don't have to go out and do this, that, and the other thing unless it's an emergency, right? And that's really what it boils down to. And that's one of the things I challenge animal control today to think about. It's like, are you responding to things you should not be responding to?
Right.
Just to clear your call log.
Keeping the shelter for the animals that truly need the shelter.
Exactly.
And trusting our community to do the right thing for the animals that they can take care of. So Scott just recently moved to Arkansas.
This is my new local shelter. Yeah, I mean, we're reimagining what sheltering can look like. And this is in Bentonville, Arkansas. Yes, a Boston boy just moved to Arkansas. Culture shock, but they'll get used to it. We're looking at, rethinking the way sheltering is done. We're looking at more foster-based, right? If you think about, I always like to think about like children, right? There used to be orphanages and things like that, and now it's unheard of, right? Let's make that for animals as well, right? People want to be part of the solution. We just have to ask them. And this is an awesome facility. If you ever get the chance to come to Northwest Arkansas, please swing by. It's the shelter of the future.
There's no cages in this shelter.
Very little.
Very little.
Very little. Some
cages.
holding areas.
Some holding areas. The animals are primarily in foster.
Yeah.
And it really leads us to think about, right, if we didn't have that impound lot, if we never set the precedent that what you do with a stray dog, because that dog might be rabid, is to bring it to a central location and kill it, what would sheltering look like? What would our role be, right, if that had never happened? It would probably look a lot like this. Well, our community needs resources for their pets. So low-cost vet care, right? Food pantries, human services, all of the things that go along with helping the community take care of their pet, and the ability to rehome the animals that really need it and provide education and fostering for the pets that we can do that for, right? Not every animal needs to come in, and it could look a lot like this, but it requires us to be brave and change our minds about some things that we've been doing for a long time.
Exactly, exactly. This is a slide I wanted to include just to talk to you all about. How many of you at any point in time have said, times are really tough, I don't know how I'm gonna get through this, right? Let's be honest, right? Things are rough. It happens to all of us. It happens to me. It happens to all of us. When it happens to me, I think back about the people that we have talked about leading up to today, particularly being from Boston, starting at the Massachusetts SPCA. George Angel founded the MSPCA. But Henry Berg and George Angel went through hell to get to where they got, right? They were ridiculed in the media. They were laughed at, right? They didn't have social media, thank God, back then. But if they did, how many of you have ever been attacked on social media?
Ooh, good question. Everybody.
Right? Right? No better or worse, but these individuals continued to fight day in and day out to make sure that they were able to achieve their vision. And their vision has brought us, for better or worse, to where we are today. And I reflect back, when times get tough on me, I reflect back and I think back about what George Angel or Henry Berg, for you New York people, right? George Angel, what they went through and how they persevered, they pushed through. And I hope that what you've heard today, you can take that back to your daily jobs when you're under attack and when you're feeling like you can't go another step, right? Those individuals, those men and women who started this industry and this movement got us to where we are, and they would not quit. And I'm just asking you to think about them when times get tough and reflect back on, yeah, they went through some pretty tough times too. And if they did it, I can do it. The next bullet point here for me was a leap of faith, right? I had mentioned earlier, I was opposed to community cat programming. I was also, I was a state police animal cruelty investigator in Massachusetts, and I used to do all the dogfighting investigations. And I was adamantly opposed to placing a dog into a home that had come out of a fight ring. Adamantly opposed. They were dangerous, not pit bulls. I wasn't pit bull, I wasn't anti-pit bull, I was anti-dogfighter. All of these things, pets as gifts, right, I was against, right? And I had to take a leap of faith, right? Because some of these things, like with the Michael Vick case, best friends changed my whole perception after the Michael Vick case. It can happen. I was wrong, and I can admit that I'm wrong, right? I've been wrong about community cats. I've been wrong about pets as gifts. I've been wrong about animal fighting. I've been wrong about so much. And sometimes it just takes a leap of faith, saying I'm going to go against everything I know in my core. I believe in my core. But it's happening. It's working. Especially like with community cat programs, brother. We talked yesterday, right? Some people are opposed to it for different reasons, but it's working, and it's saving animals' lives. So take that leap of faith and just step off that bridge, because it works. And if you don't, you're going to be doing the same thing that you've always done and getting the same thing you've always gotten. Because we have an obligation, and Julie Castle, how many of you saw Julie Castle's thing yesterday morning? Oh my God, right? Adore her, she's so inspiring. The next us, right? Think about the next us. And I mentioned earlier, 5, 10, 15 years from now, 20 years ago, if I was sitting in this workshop saying, oh my God, cats adoptions at Halloween, are you kidding me? Right? We have to set the tone for the next us, right? We are leading the way for that next generation. We are the George Angels, the Henry Bergs of today. And we have an obligation to the next generation to make it better. We have an obligation to the animals that we're serving every single day. And it's no small obligation. It's no small responsibility. And that's why I love what Julie showed that the thing from the Lord of the Rings, carrying him up the hill. We're all in this together. I always use the phrase in my team, one team, one mission, right? We're all in this together, and we can do it, and we're doing it.
We are doing it.
We are doing it. It's happening. But just push through. You get attacked on Facebook. You wouldn't believe some of the crap that I have had happen to me on Facebook, right? When I look at it, I like to think that I'm doing my job. I'm doing my job because I know what I'm doing is right. 5 years from now, someone might say something different. I'll be like, okay, I'll take that leap of faith, right? We got to continuously to have open minds, open hearts, and do what needs to be done and do it together.
So just looking at what's going on in your shelter that's preventing animals from getting out alive, why are you doing those things? What are the reasons? How did that start? Does it still make sense? What would happen if we did it different? And what could we do instead? So we've got some resources to some best practices for programming here for you guys. Thanks very much for spending some time with us. We'll take some questions if anybody has.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? We were that good? Awesome. Could you come up to the... You know what? I'll run to you and let you talk into my... You're supposed to talk into
This isn't awkward at all. We got this. My question is just, how do you, when you're talking at shelters, how do you talk about like maybe the forgiveness part for yourself, like when you have done things in a way that maybe you don't feel okay about and that you kind of still carry with you?
I love that question. What a great question. And I'd like to address it on a very personal level. I've been in this business a long time, as I said, and I have euthanized more than my fair share of animals, healthy adoptable animals, fighting dogs, feral cats. Oh my gosh, feral cats came into the shelter, gone. It is extremely difficult to come to terms with that on a personal level. For me, I think it gives me a lot of drive and a lot of, I use it, right, to fuel my fire, right? Because I feel to a degree I have an obligation. I remember the first animal I ever euthanized. I remember specific animals that shouldn't have been euthanized, that were euthanized, and it is extremely difficult, and it is something very personal that you have to learn to come to grips with. I turn that outward. Have I sat in the corner of my house crying? Yeah. I might do it tonight for all I know after this one, but it is something that it's when I look back and what I mentioned earlier, it didn't come from a bad place, right? I trusted, like I still to this day, my shelter manager, my first shelter manager, Jean Weber, I adore her. I like idolize her. She is one of my heroes. She told me that Satanists were coming in to adopt the cats, right? And I wouldn't let that happen. So I did what I thought I had to do, right? And that's really where we need to strive to get to, right? I think I've done pretty good with it. I utilize it. I mean, I've been in this business 30 some odd years and I've gotten the crap kicked out of me, right? I've seen some pretty horrible things in my day. I've met some pretty horrible people. How do I get up in the morning and do it all over again? Because I think of that small little black and white kitten. I think of those fighting dogs that looked at me with those sad eyes, like they didn't do anything, I didn't do anything. And I use that because I don't want anyone in this room to have to go through it. When I talk to people in a shelter, I don't want you to have to do what I had to do. So I'm going to share that with you. And I'm going to be by your side, and my email's not up there, but you are more than welcome to email me, call me, and we can talk. And I mean that for everyone, because we are all in this together. One team, one mission. Let's get it done. And if someone's having a hard time, I'll help you. McKenna will help you. Audrey will help you. Everyone in this room will help you get through it.
Right. You did the best that you could with the information that you had.
Yeah.
Right? And we're all doing something new by taking this country no-kill. And there's going to be bumps along the way, and we're going to make mistakes. We are, right? But the bravest thing we can do is change our mind and do it different and move forward.
Sorry, I want to give you a hug.
Oh.
I'm with you. I appreciate you. Sorry, little moment.
All right, so on that note, if anybody wants to see the picture of the girl with the squirrel, it'll be up at the front. I also have some cool animal welfare stamps you can check out and some other stuff. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, everybody.